All right, so let's talk about licensing. So
Okay.
what role does licensing play in your job?
Okay.
You can describe your job a little bit if you want.
So, an architect is one who designs buildings, and so the licensure is directed by each state. So it's not federally enumerated. The state holds the power to grant licenses to their architects. And basically, in order to call yourself an architect and to practice architecture in that state, you have to have a license in that state to practice architecture. I mean, there's some things that I am not entirely certain of. Like, I'm pretty sure that calling yourself an architect is not something that the state cares about. I mean, they might care about it because you're like falsely advertising, but mostly it's enforced by the AIA, which is the American Institute of Architects, which is not involved in licensure, but it's like the trade group, like it's like a nonprofit trade group that that doesn't enforce licensure, and it doesn't, make sure that people are licensed, but it does enforce, like, it basically protects the
trade,
right? So like they go after people who aren't architects that call themselves architects, like they'll find them and stuff like that.
And they're not government.
No.
Okay.
So the AIA is not a government organization. It's nonprofit, private group. Licensing is just taken care of by each state. There's 50 or 51 different boards that govern licensure in their state.
Okay.
Yeah.
And do you know what they did before the state was involved in licensing, or if you don't know, it's okay. I'm just curious.
So I'm not entirely sure, but basically it was just, you were just a builder, and the practice of it was very much, it was a lot less administrative. Basically you would design a building, you would draw it, and then you would sort of build it and see it through construction. Now a lot of it is like, and a big reason for the licensure is, of course life safety is important. That's one of the big reasons, but there's also a lot of legal issues, litigational issues, like making sure insurances are taken care of and things like that. A lot of that stuff more so is what licensure is concerned about, and a lot of that stuff didn't exist back then.
Yeah.
So, we're licensed. When you're licensed and you're practicing, you have to have an errors and omissions insurance, which would cover an architect for any errors in the drawings or things he left out in the drawings. It's just sort of like a malpractice insurance.
Does it have to cause some sort of injury or accident, or
No.
it's just they find some error?
Yeah. So there's if people can sue for financial damages and things like that.
So it would be a civil.
Right.
lawsuit.
It would be a civil suit.
Okay.
And things that would cause life injuries and things like that, that would be, criminal charges could be brought to you. But I mean, that was the same back then.
Yeah.
It's just the licensure, I guess seeks to head it off at the pass or
There's some
something.
legitimacy.
Yeah.
But you practice as an architect without you're not licensed yet. Right?
Correct.
You're
Yeah,
an
I'm not
architect,
licensed.
so-
What I do, and basically how it is, because they understand that like one guy can't do everything.
Yeah.
And so it's like a licensed architect, if he has people working under him, he has to make sure that the work they do is under his direct supervision. So like I do drawings.
So he signs off on
right.
it. Okay.
And basically, yeah. So and that's what the stamp is for. The stamp and a little signature on there ensures that, well, it doesn't ensure anything, but at least it's supposed to ensure that the person who is licensed takes responsibility for everything he stamps.
Okay.
So if I do a drawing and it's his responsibility, if he stamps it, that he's like, okay, I'm taking responsibility for your work. I understand that. And so then he sends it out. Sometimes, I mean, sometimes people are willing to take the risk of stamping things that they didn't directly supervise. But, you know, that's not something that I would do. It's not something recommended. You're not supposed to do that. But, I mean,
you could. Let's see. So you already, my next question is what's the purpose of architectural licensing, which you already mentioned, the safety and some other things, if you could elaborate a little bit on that. But like safety obviously is what they always say for occupational licensing.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's more to it than just the safety concern and the liability. So
right.
I guess if you want to elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, a lot of the building codes and things which we have to go by are sort of this, you know, it's like what OSHA says, like everything's written in blood. Like there's a big fire and, you know, they found that people couldn't get out because the doors opened in, like so people would try to get out but they'd be crushed. And so now the code is that all exit doors have to open out. So it's like, okay, things like that. And licensure makes sure that, you know, someone is responsible for making sure that all the doors open out.
Oh, okay.
And the architect, in being licensed, takes on that responsibility and that risk. Now, it seems like an easy thing to do, but in a big enough building and projects everywhere, you know, in, you know, fast-paced world, sometimes it's easy to miss stuff like that. And so licensure is to ensure that the people who are designing these things are up to a certain standard. You know, not everyone's going to be the best at designing fancy buildings. Maybe they do crappy buildings, but at the very least, the exit doors open out.
Yeah.
That's an example.
Do you feel like the licensing requirement by the state has made that safer, or is?
I think it has to a certain degree because, you know, I think the ability of a designer to self-regulate that kind of thing is the idea, I guess, is that in order to be insured, they want, you know, there's pressure from the insurance market, there's pressure from the client's market, there's pressure from, you know, municipalities to have a guy who the state says knows what they're doing.
Yeah.
You know, there's draftsmen that do work and do good work that aren't licensed, and it's fine. You know, no one's died, and they do perfectly fine drawings and things like that. It is a bit of a protectionist thing. You know, the AIA encourages people to be licensed because the more licensed architects there are, the more members they have, the more dues they collect. So there's incentives for people to push licensure. I think the incentive on the part of the states is to mitigate big disasters like that, and to shed responsibility of themselves.
Yeah.
The states, you know, all municipalities check all buildings for code compliance and things like that. And when you have state licensed architects doing designing, the less work they have to do and the less responsibility they take on. So it's kind of a give and take. Like, you know, if anybody could do it, if there was no licensing and they were just like, okay, anybody can draw, we're just going to have really strict plan checks on our side, you know, then they're taking on, you know, what they might consider a undue responsibility.
Would it be, this is just my imagination, would it be possible with the pressure from insurance or not having insurance, the AIA saying, you know, we're the recognized and legitimate entity that says you're an architect or you're not, and I guess from the state saying if you hurt someone you're responsible,
right.
You know, if it can be proved that it was your
if that
building that locked someone in, yeah, would that be enough to say? Because I guess point in my paper is not that licensing itself is bad. It's the idea of state licensing, having to pay the state for a license.
Right.
But if you could get a license through other means, like I mentioned, like AAA, checks if certain mechanics and stuff are like AAA certified, and they won't let them say, they'll go after them if they're saying they're AAA certified, but they're actually not, and that's just of their own choice. Would that be enough, or would that be possible? Or
I think that it would, and essentially, my knowledge of the involvement of the state isn't all encompassing.
Yeah.
But there are. Yeah, I think that would be fine. It would definitely require a lot more due diligence on the part of the insurers. Vet different people. And the AIA does have, they do significant like post-education things like that. They're always putting out, educational materials so that, architects could stay up to date. And in the process of doing this licensure thing, it's not like the state, they're like, okay, we have our guys and we're going to come up with these things. They bring like private architects in to make this stuff up, like to come up with the questions and everything and like that. And so it's like the private entities have done all the work, and then the state, is the over-encompassing thing that gives the thing legitimacy in the eyes of whatever it is. So I think it would be possible. I just people expect the government to be the authority. So that's that's sort of where it comes from.
And you mentioned the protectionist angle a little bit. Obviously, with licensing means, by definition, less people will be in that field, which could be a good thing. Less architects running around, building buildings.
Right.
But I don't know. Are there other? You mentioned the unions. Are there other like interests involved in trying to, like you said, it's the private insurance groups who get together and write all the rules, just like it is with barbers or cosmetology or other. They write all the rules, and then they join with the government saying, okay, these are the requirements to be licensed. You have to take these certifications or take these classes or this many hours of training or whatever. I guess where I'm going with this is, are those other interests involved in licensing? Is it just for, public health and safety and consumer, quality, or is it trying to limit some competition there to say, okay, it's better to have less, and maybe not for architects, but
And so I think if you looked at it on the state side, it's like, they're being paid for the public good. So, there are some people who are, altruistic about it, and I'm sure that they're like, that's a good thing. As far as the private side goes, I think that the main benefit for like small architects and big architects alike is it's sort of like a forced educational requirement. So it's like, if you have a bachelor's in architecture, then that means that you went through certain things. You went through things that you know about. You did studio time. You had a certain amount of hours into a class or a studio, or you did design reviews. You designed buildings and things like that. You have a portfolio. When you're licensed, that also means that you've done certain things, minimal things. You've studied the materials. You've taken the tests, which are fairly rigorous. And it's for me, I view it as like a shared experience, that if someone's hiring someone, they're like, okay, I've been through that. I know what you've gone through now, and I can at least have a fair amount of confidence that you're capable in those things. Now, of course, that's possible in a private institution also. You don't, it could be the same thing, getting a bachelor's is a private institution, getting a master's or a PhD, you can do those at private institutions, and it would provide the same benefit. And yeah, there are protectionist issues, and there are, it sort of separates people. I think one of the main good things that come from licensure and architecture, at least, it separates the people who want to take responsibility and the people who don't want to take responsibility. Because there's people that I've seen in some offices, and they're, in their 50s and 60s, they've been doing architecture their whole lives, but they don't want to get licensed because they don't want to stamp drawings, they don't want to be called an architect, whatever their reasons are. They've kept themselves out of that realm.
So they're not the ones who have the final say. Is that
exactly?
So it's not even like it's not even like they're bad people.
Right.
It's just that they don't want the final.
Exactly.
stamp.
Some people are like that. They just don't want the responsibility, and they're happy to do that. And so that, when I look at it, that seems to be one of the main things. It's like it separates tiers of people. There are people that want to just do stuff and draw, and then there's people that want the responsibility and the added risk and the added reward.
Yeah.
I mean, you just get paid more.
No, we have that in teaching too, because teaching is the same thing. It's like you may have a credential in like special ed or administration, but some people don't. They want to teach in the classroom. So it's sounds like some a similar idea.
Yeah, and there's of course there's benefits to that there's draftsmen in the valley who will do they can do little work patios and things like that, and then there's the architects who and one thing that I've seen sometimes is each the state governs the licensure, but each municipality governs the building process and the plan check process. So like Lancaster has their own plan check department. Palmdale has their own plan check department. The state has said in California that you don't need a license to design single-family residences up to 2 stories tall.
Oh, really?
In built in wood. You don't need a license to do that. But but sometimes the local municipalities who have the final say, like they override. I mean, they can set higher standards than state and federal standards. Sometimes they'll say, nope, you gotta have an architect. We'll only accept this with an architect's stamp on it or an engineer's stamp on it. And so they send them to us or to some of the other architects around here. And so that puts some of the draftsmen out of that realm. And so sometimes we have draftsmen who come to us and be like, hey, I drew this thing. Can you take a look at it, review it, and stamp it? And sometimes we do that if we know them well enough.
Yeah.
But again, that's just an extra layer that they have to do. I mean, essentially, like if they've drawn it well enough, we don't have to do anything. all we did was take responsibility for that. And what's going to happen? I mean, it would take a 9.0 earthquake to knock anything down around here, and if that happens, then
you probably get
the whole
problems.
system. The whole system is kind of out of whack, and so you've got things like that where it's like where the municipalities kind of lean on that. We don't want to take the responsibility of letting this draftsman just draw whatever he wants, and so we're gonna lean on this licensure system to.
So people may be designing stuff and designing buildings and houses that are perfectly good.
Yeah.
And getting them stamped by an architect who's official,
right,
who hasn't contributed necessarily anything but the stamp to the plan
and the review. Yeah.
So it's interesting because that's what one of the objections would probably be is if you didn't have licensing, you'd have all these unlicensed people building houses, and it's like, well, in a lot of cases we do have them building houses.
Happens.
They're just getting stamped by a licensed architect.
Right.
So, and they're perfectly good houses.
It's and you don't see it a lot here because it's California. But like in Montana and Idaho, people like contractors just build houses. They know what they're doing. the
well,
houses
yeah,
are
a lot
fine.
of people talk about building their own house and
Yeah,
stuff like
so-
that, and actually just go for it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see. I had another question on here. We already kind of answered that one. What has occupational license? What impact has it had on the profession and on the consumers? We already talked about that. What should I be asking that I haven't asked, that I'm missing when I'm talking about? Because my position is at least that I'm taking for this paper is kind of, I guess, extreme. It's, let's say, just get rid of,
Yeah.
we got all occupational licensing altogether, from not licensing itself necessarily, but from the state.
Yeah.
Which gets hard with surgeons and doctors and things like that, or lawyers, or or
Right.
people would mention like electricians or maybe architects and stuff. But I've asked what I can think of to ask from not being an architect, but maybe what am I?
Yeah, I think maybe. I mean, I guess you can ask. Where does enforcement come from? In a sort of if it was a private thing, because when we talk about like, okay, the architect designed something like back in the 1800s and it collapsed and killed people, like, okay, he's now held responsible, but even in that context, the state is the one enforcing that. They would either pursue it, because what if like the owner was in that thing and he died too? Like who's there to pursue grievances or something?
Yeah.
And that's sort of how I see this as well. That the state lends their the weight of the police and the courts and things like that, which a private entity, at least in this climate, wouldn't necessarily have.
No, there.
Yeah, you could
for it now.
You could have the courts and things like that, but as they are, there's enough litigation even with licensure. It's like pretty much. I would say like 90% of buildings or projects that are over like $2 to $4 million in like budget or anything is in court.
Oh,
like
really?
Literally, like every building project you ever see probably goes to court over something. I mean, it could be small claims, it could be something else, but there's always some dispute, and building litigation is a growing part of the construction industry.
Yeah.
And that to me means that there's a problem, because that's not a good thing. Like if when the litigation starts expanding, there's something underlying there that at least to me, is not a good thing.
Has it expanded in the last like decade?
20 to 30 years.
20 years,
yeah.
really? Okay.
Yeah.
So there's more suits. Are they civil suits or like?
Yes. Yeah, they're just.
Well, I
civil
guess
suits.
it would be mostly civil suits anyway, but.
Exactly. So you get issues like with with billing and some subcontractor doesn't get paid. There's like a change or something, and someone doesn't want to pay, or the work doesn't get done, and stuff like that. And it's just what has the latest round of licensing done to help that, and it hasn't.
Yeah. Well, it just makes me think about the opportunity cost and time for judges and how people want to sue over everything. But which kind of one of the questions I had to deal with, or having to deal with, is it's a question in American law anyway.
Yeah.
Is our system's built around the idea of you can't do anything until someone is wronged or hurt or injured or killed.
Right.
And we like to prevent everything, which occupational licensing is one of its arguments for it, is that, the license will prevent a lot of that stuff, headed off, like you said.
Right.
That they're running out of, that the judges only have a certain amount of time and things like that. And if licensing isn't
doing
isn't
it.
actually maintaining the safety. And
Right.
So that's a problem of the law courts. But I wonder just how it would be dealt with, without that type of thing. If there'd be more suing, if there'd be less suing, that.
And that's because there are some like basics that licensure has improved, like the life safety, accessibility for disabled people. Like that's been taken care of in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and so that's kind of like the floor of licensing. And so it's like, and that's also made its way into the education. So even people that don't get their license, okay, they understand that they understand these things. What I've found that's just recently becoming is this this new, or not new necessarily, but it's this business side of the license thing where you're it's contract law, it's making sure that you're out of the range of the owner's civil clause.
Oh, okay.
and
make sure.
And so the problem with some of the licensure tests is that if something changes in the field of architecture, each test of license is like, it's about a 15 to 20 year cycle of things that they test on and things that how they change the test. Like they recently changed it to the tests are the ARE, the Architectural Registration Exams, and they just switched to 5.0 right now. So, how many times have they? And I took the 4.0 tests, and I think they had those since the 90s.
Are
so
these
it's like,
versions of the test?
Yeah, versions of the test. So, with Paul's test, it changes every year. So they're like, whoever does that, it keeps up pretty quickly. But the problem with the architecture license, I don't know if it's the same medical boards, but the architectural cycles are very long, and so if something comes up, they won't get to it until the next cycle. Exactly, and so there's that aspect to it, and then there's just frankly the aspect that there's a lot of information that you can't test on everything, and you can't make sure that everyone knows everything. And so it's like, if it is about information and making sure everyone's as best as they can be, that's impossible.
Yeah. Well, it's just like, it reminds me of a book on economics by Thomas Sowell, where he talks about, that we ask people like questions like, well, how clean do you want your water to be? And they think, well, it's 100%. But yeah, you can never have 100% clean water. There's always some impurities, but you're willing to pool your risk at some point, if the Starbucks triple filter is good enough, or not. You can never get it to completely safe, like you're saying, or have everybody know everything.
Yeah.
So then people don't realize, I think, sometimes that they compare everything to perfection. So it's like, okay, well, what if we didn't have licenses? We would have people who were doing this stuff, or people would, there would be accidents that would cause. It's like, well, there are accidents now, or doctors accidentally kill people and do stuff like that. But I remember what I was going to say is that should the goal of the laws and the licensing be, should it be until someone's hurt or injured, or should that action is taken by the government to deal with that problem, or should they try to prevent it? And we all kind of like to, or a lot of people lean toward the preventing, which occupational licensing would, that'd be an argument for that. Right. But on the other hand, it's like, well, until your building actually hurts someone, you haven't committed a crime against them. But if it does, that is the government's responsibility to make sure that's handled. But sometimes it's hard to find who's ultimately responsible, right? Because the guy who built the building may have gotten it stamped by.
Yeah, and it's happened a lot too. They find new things that go wrong all the time, and so it's. I think it's kind of like everyone needs to learn from this one guy's example.
Yeah.
And, maybe you learn the history of it, or you just see the rule and you're like, what is this rule about? Like, why is this even here? And then it's like, okay, well, some guy died doing this thing. And
like you said, the OSHA rules are written in blood. It's someone made a mistake, and then everybody has to has to kind of learn.
At the expense of time and money, and sometimes it doesn't need to be, and sometimes it does, and sometimes it's very arbitrary.
Yeah.
Like it's just how did you come up with this number? Like, where did you get this from?
Yeah.
So it's a complex, dance between, licensure and following the code, because, even the draftsman, if you don't have a license, you still have to follow the building code.
Right.
And so it's like, okay, if there's a building code, if there's a standard that everyone has to follow regardless, then what's the point of a license? So my answer to that question would be responsibility, one, because the state doesn't want to be responsible for the code, and they're not. And two, it's because the third-party plan checker, the state plan checker, doesn't necessarily want to spend, all this time making sure your plans comply with the code. So usually there's even on the smallest house, there's at least 2 or 3 people who look at the plans to make sure that it complies with the code. On bigger buildings, it could be 20 or 30 people that look at the plans. And it's just, more people who are competent looking at plans. Does licensure mean that they're confident? Not necessarily.
No, but there's a better chance in a way. It's just
sometimes.
Yeah, maybe I think it's helped refine, thinking through these things, refine my position a little bit more to not just saying licenses mean nothing, or certification of any kind means nothing, but whether or not there's enough pressures from different things that it has to be state pressure, but besides that it will enforce if you injure someone, or something like or almost injure someone.
Right.
But interesting. So, all right. Is there anything else I need to know about architecture and licensing?
Not really. I mean, I like the idea. I like the AIA. I think that's a good organization. And the good thing about those organizations, private organizations, is that they can do the research of events that happen around the world that even states don't do. Like they'll say, hey, look at this club fire over in Finland or something. Like we need to examine that and things like that. And you have companies like Underwriters Laboratory and American National Standards Institute, all these certification companies that certify products. Like you'll see UL listings on all this stuff. Those are private companies. That do these certifications, Consumer Reports, things like that. It's just that people want their products, and the government will use them. They'll be like, hey, this has to be UL listed, and it's like, it's a private company, and they're like, we trust that they do good work and that they ensure that this product, doesn't catch fire instantaneously. So it's like, okay, well,
which is really interesting to me. I hadn't really thought about that private companies do a lot of the legwork. Anyway, it's like when people talk about roads and stuff, it's like, well, private companies are contracted most of the time by the government to do the roads. So obviously they can do it. It's just whether or not, there are different systems for working those things out.
Yeah, and pretty much the only difference is they make the government acts as like a standardizer. Right. And then they make sure that everyone gets paid way more than prevailing wage.
But that's interesting. The AIA is a private nonprofit, and it kind of reminds me of the kind of AAA stamp of approval a little bit. That they'll go to mechanics and tell them to take off you can't say you're AAA.
Yeah, so the AIA, they do marketing, they put out literature to people, be like, hey, there's a list of architects in your area that you can go to and things like that. So, they do a lot of good work.
Well, like you said, they can do a lot more work than a bureaucracy. Or bureaucracy, if we assume that all the people in a bureaucracy are good people with good intentions, which isn't always the case either. But if we assume that they are, even that, they may not have the knowledge, they may not have be able to calculate they may not
budget
have they get a certain budget every year, and they're focused on, will they have their same budget next year? And so there's some of those issues that don't come up with the AIA. I'm sure they have their own issues.
Exactly, and like California architect, what is their concern with like something that happens halfway around the world?
Yeah.
Well, the AIA is concerned with it, and they can be, and California's like, well, we got to deal with our own thing, so.
Good time.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
I think that's it.